Paul Frashour was serving his time in the Lima Correctional Institution, almost 100 miles northwest of Columbus, when he received a letter that reflected the style of the earlier letters that had plagued Circleville for so long. The bold block capitals remained, taunting Paul from the page. Prior to his incarceration, many in Circleville had believed he was guilty of penning the letters. Indeed, the sheriff and the local media had been making no bones about pinning the guilt of the Circleville writer onto Frashour. That first letter, however, was simply the first of many that he would go on to receive during his time spent in jail, all of which taunted Paul in his current situation. An excerpt of one was quite clear and read, "Shame how things work out, but better you than me. The sheriff says you did it, but we know better, don't we?" Worse perhaps for law enforcement in Circleville, and in all probability for the residents themselves, the letters continued to find their way to mailboxes of residences throughout Circleville. Some assumed Frashour was smuggling them out of prison, and the sheriff, in his attempts to alleviate the local fears, hastily had Paul placed into solitary. Still the letters came. One local paper reported on the letters sent whilst Paul was incarcerated and placed the number into the hundreds. Throughout, Sheriff Radcliffe maintained the police had done their duty, despite evidence mounting to the contrary. "I think we got the right man," he said. "I know what Frashour wants. He's trying to say, look, I'm in prison, but the letters have never stopped." This was a bold attempt to soothe the fears around Circleville, especially as no method or theory as to how the letters might have been coming out of the prison was offered. Tessa Unwin, the spokesman for Pickaway State Prison System, stated publicly herself that it would be almost impossible to smuggle the letters from the prison. "They keep a real close eye on him and his visitors. I don't see any way humanly possible for him to sneak out something," she said. Despite the headaches the letters were causing Sheriff Radcliffe, they were bolstering Frashour's likelihood of an early release. In 1988, he applied for parole, but his appeal was denied. In an act of desperation, he submitted himself voluntarily for 3 separate polygraph tests, all of which he passed. Though after his next appeal in 1993, he was once again denied early parole. Finally, in 1994, after 10.5 years behind bars and statements from prison wardens were made that cast strong doubt in his ability to send letters from his position in jail, his appeal was granted and he was released. And throughout all of this, still the letters continued. After his incarceration ended, Paul Frashour put together a 176-page PDF in which he documents his side of events, annotating press coverage, trial transcripts, and various official documentation, maintaining his own innocence in both the letter writing and the formation of the booby trap. Much of the document also focused on several conspiracies that mounted to a mountain of corruption being carried out by those at the top of law enforcement within Circleville. The documentation was sent to the FBI, and the cover letter started off strongly, pulling few punches. "Dear FBI, I am asking that you get involved in my former brother-in-law's murder, because I believe it was a murder and covered up by the sheriff of Pickaway County here in the state of Ohio. I was sent to prison because a series of obscene and threatening letters had the county in a panic. I did 10.5 years, and the letters continued undisturbed and uninterrupted, just as always." Frashour then goes on to make several claims, all of which he thinks had strong evidence, including that he had offered to pay a reward for information on the letter writer, but Sheriff Radcliffe had disallowed it, that many of the letters contained arsenic, and a conspiracy perpetrated by Sheriff Radcliffe himself in order to protect his reputation and advance his career. "I believe that the obscene, threatening and dangerous letters were concealed because they would interfere with Sheriff Radcliffe becoming the National Sheriff Association's president," he wrote. See the date of the letters and the date of his involvement with the National Sheriff's Association. The crime rate in Pickaway County at the time would have eliminated him from this appointment. In fact, this was just the start of the corruption according to Fresh Hour, and he goes on to accuse the sheriff of mismanagement of funds, as well as fudging crime figures over a number of years. He then goes on to claim that one of the prosecutors in his trial was also trying to cover up their own rather large and ugly mess. He claimed that important details concerning the case, specifically those that involved a local schoolteacher, Vicky Koch, herself a victim of unsolved murder and to this very day, were being buried and kept out of the public eye, and even goes as far as to outright accuse him of murder, giving the motive of an illicit pregnancy between herself and the prosecutor that, if uncovered by the letters, would have gone on to destroy his legal career. Dramatically, according to Fresh Hour, one of the letters threatened to dig up the bones of a baby from the cemetery and mail them out across the county if outside investigations didn't get involved with the murder case, and claimed that the sheriff had tried to cover this up. The level of corruption that Fresh Hour accuses the local law enforcement of ran incredibly deep, and essentially boiled down to his arrest, trial and incarceration having been carried out as a way to further the careers of the powers that be, and to show the sheriff as a local hero for solving the case, despite the fact that letters carried on whilst he was in jail. Fresh Hour even accuses the sheriff of propagating the rumours that it was Fresh Hour writing the letters from jail. These accusations maintain that the covered up information was intentional to stop this truth from coming out on a grand scale. As if the spider's web was not wound tightly enough around the case of the Circleville letters, entered journalist and private investigator Martin Yant. Yant investigated the Circleville Letters case in 1993 for an article he was writing for Columbus Alive. Piecing together both contemporary statements made by him as well as a communication with him in early 2017 with a user from the Unsolved Mysteries online message boards, Yant tells an interesting tale of two parts with two quite different letter writers. In the first, Yant claims that the original letter writer was a man by the name of David Longbury who worked at the local school and had something of an infatuation for Mary. However, after she rebuffed his advances, Yant theorises that Longbury embarked on the rather epic journey of writing thousands of letters over many years in a jealous rage, justified to himself as a way to get back at Mary. The second half of Yant's conclusions concern Fresh Hour and his divorce to his ex-wife, Ron Gillespie's sister, Karen Sorrick, in 1983. In the months prior to his arrest for attempted murder, Paul Fresh Hour was wading through a rather messy divorce. Things were not looking good for Karen, who had been caught by Paul having an affair. She had lost everything in the divorce settlement, including her home and custody of their two children. After their divorce, she moved into a trailer on Mary Gillespie's land, and during her time there, she told Mary that Paul was the Circleville writer. Mary promptly relayed this accusation to Sheriff Radcliffe, and less than 2 weeks later, Paul was arrested. After his incarceration, Karen received everything she had lost from the settlement: the house, custody of the children, and even Paul's pension. Writing to the parole board in 1993 in support of Fresh Hour's release from prison, Yant wrote of Karen, "In my 22 years as a journalist and investigator, I don't think I've ever met an individual so consumed with such irrational hatred for another and a willingness to say anything, no matter how provably false, to defame him." He then goes on to drop quite the heavy bombshell that related back to the mysterious colour-shifting Chevrolet El Camino from Fresh Hour's trial. As I related in Columbus Alive, this report placed a man unlike Paul Fresh Hour in appearance at the scene of his alleged crime shortly before it occurred. Although I didn't say it in the article, the colour and model of the vehicle the man appeared to be driving matched the description of one owned by a brother of Karen Sue Sorrick. Before attempting to make any sort of conclusions, we are perhaps in need of a recap. Here we have a story of an anonymous letter writer who, amongst other things, was hell-bent on outing an affair between Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver, and Gordon Massey, the school superintendent. At least one, but possibly two unsolved deaths in both Mary's husband, Ron Gillespie, and later a school teacher, Vicky Koch. A bitter divorce that heavily implies the framing of Paul Freshour, landing him in prison for over 10 years. Claims of deep and winding corruption entrenched in the Pickaway County legal system. And throughout it all, over 20 years of disturbing letters that totaled into the thousands. If we accept Yant's story of events and run with the two-writer theory, we can answer the mystery of the Circleville writer. However, with his suspect David Longbury, there is motive for Mary and Ron's letters, but what of the hundreds and thousands of other letters written to hundreds of other residents? Whilst true that many letters seem to concern the school system, what motive would he have had to accuse, threaten and harass so many various people for all manner of activities, most of which had zero to do with him? Whether or not the claims made by Paul Freshour regarding the corruption were true or not remains unresolved. He clearly went to some degree of effort to write the lengthy document and surely had a degree of confidence in his claims, as he sent it to the FBI requesting that they take investigative action. He also maintained a website that hosted much of the documentation right up until his death in 2012. For the sake of a conclusion, we can set this aside for now. Without an official investigation, it is highly likely none of the truths behind these claims will be known, whether they support Paul's story or not. However, even by treating the case in such a blasé manner as this, we are still left with pondering the motives of many. What exactly was the relationship between Mary and Sheriff Radcliffe? And right at the top, what of the mystery of Ron's death? Why did the sheriff so readily change his mind from foul play to accidental? What of the alcohol found in his system despite his family arguing against him being drunk at the time he left the house? And what of the mysterious bullet fired from his gun? The Circleville Letters is a mystery that runs incredibly deep and twists and turns at every possible corner. Was David Longbury really the original writer? In the late 90s, Longbury went on the run after raping an 11-year-old girl and was found having hung himself several years later. During the time he was on the run, there were rumours that the letters continued. In fact, there have been sporadic reports of letters being received right up until 2003. The sheer span of time and volume of letters is a mind-bending mystery in itself. 15 years on, with no letters reported, it seems as though the plague of the Circleville Letters might finally be behind the town, allowing it to return to its cosy days of annual pumpkin shows. For long-time residents who oversaw the entire timeline of events, however, is there a nagging in the back of their minds that wonders if the town will ever be free? As they approach their mailboxes to pick up the day's post, do they feel a twinge when they see a Columbus postmark? And do they let out a quiet sigh of relief when there is no sign of the familiar heavy yellow paper with their address written in thick, squared-off block capitals? I know where you live.